Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to the ongoing biography or life, if you prefer, of Isaac Asimov. Now, last time we left him in sort of the early 1960s, and let me just refresh my notes here to see where we were. Um yeah, around, the early 60s. And he met Werner von Braun, yes, at a convention in 1963. And he wasn't that impressed. And the fact that he had to shake hands with someone that actually shook hands with Hitler made him feel very, very strange. And I would say, like, yeah, during the 60s, he began to shift his writing from fiction, science fiction, to nonfiction. And here is one of the ones he did for Doubleday. It's called Life and Energy, an exploration of the physical and chemical basis of modern biology. And this is it was done in 1962, published, and 1963, and this is the British edition by uh, Dennis Dobson. So as I say, he changed it quite well. He changed his writing quite a bit because he realized it was he could reuse a lot of material that he had been writing before, and incorporate it. And he's got like the sections here: part one, energy, and then part two, the body. And they're almost as if they are little essays. Um, yeah, and he also began doing a lot of talks. He started in the late 50s with an agency, a local agency, to go to after dinner speeches, that type of thing. And when he first did it, he was like, he sort of did a couple for free, I think, and then he sort of thought, well, $50. He was hesitant, and then finally, yeah, his fee was $500 per speaking engagement, and he did about two to three throughout New England. But his partnership, or his working for an agency did not last that long. It lasted a few years, but because of his fear or anxiety of traveling, he would only go, like, locally, obviously Boston area, New England, and maybe as far as field as Philadelphia. He did several, and then New York City, obviously, because he would combine it with other tasks for publishers as well. And in November 1963, he did have a talk in New York City, and it was the JFK had been shot, and he felt really bad about this, and he sort of said, well, he'll go back to Boston and he won't take his fee and not do the talk. But he was sort of talked into saying, well, go there and see what happens, you know. And if anybody shows up, and the place was packed, it filled up, and it was like he sort of realized that people wanted a respite from, and something to take their minds off of the presidential shooting. And that actually worked for him as well once he got into the stride of talking about it. Uh, and yeah, he just continued to write in his attic. The relationship with his wife was sort of still going downhill during the time, and but he had a son and daughter. He doted on his daughter Robin, and throughout, I've mentioned this already. Throughout the autobiography, there's not much talked about with regards to David. He mentions him going to school, having troubles with school and fitting in. Um, and the 60s, mid 60s, and so forth was, teenage years for him, so it was difficult. And he went away to a school as well for high school, which he paid for. And Also during the 60s, he was getting away from his fiction writing, but also too, he was sort of, it wasn't distancing himself, but he sort of less so with old friends like Campbell. They're still friends, and Heinlein and so forth, and a few of them that he still saw, but he began to get a new sort of group of friends, such as Harlan Ellison, Ben Bova, who was local, Lester Del Rey, and then later Julie Lynn Del Rey when she married Lester, and Martin H. Greenberg, the anthologist editor. Not to be confused with Martin Greenberg, who started and ran um, Gnome Press, which he had, issues with. Not that he was dishonest, but that he was disorganized, and Asimov never got sort of a tallying or a listing of how many books he sold. He thinks he finally got the money out of him, the correct amount of money, but then he got all the books back, and then they went to Doubleday. And by the mid 60s, he was making in excess of $100,000 a year with over $250,000 in savings. So that's a lot of money. But he still lived frugally in a sort of suburban home. And he had issues occasionally at times with kids that would come and make noise and stuff like this, and it bothered him reading, and his writing and everything. So he finally at some point went out and actually talked to them, and he was surprised that then all of a sudden everything quietened down. They sort of they sort of went quiet as they passed his house and that, and he realized that rather than getting angry and screaming at them, that just talking did a lot more. And in he was approached in like 65, 66 to write a novelization for an upcoming film called Fantastic Voyage, that a science fiction novel where I don't if anybody's seen it, but it's where there's a medical emergency and they shrink down a team of scientists and doctors, and a little submarine type thing, and they inject it into the body so they can go in and do things. He was very hesitant to do this because um, he he, uh, he read the script and he realized that there was a lot of inconsistencies to this, because like one of the penultimate part, or the ending, and the um, tension was got from the can they get out quick enough before they expand and go to the full size. And they eventually get out, but the submarine is still left in there, and he's going, well, that'll go to full size and kill the person. But that didn't phase them, and they didn't listen to him. So he wrote the book, and it was well received, more or less. It came out actually before the film, so a lot of people thought that the film was based on his novel, but no, he based the novel on the script, so it's a novelization from it. And I can't think of the actress that was in it. A buxom 60, like 50s, 60s sex icon, that he had like he was offered to go to Hollywood to meet the cast and her, um, but because of his fear of flying, he never did. Uh, he never did. So, and during this time as well, he began. He had met Janet Jepson, as we saw earlier, at a signing, but he had kidney stones at the time, and he made a flippant remark or something because she said she was a psychologist, and he made a flippant remark. Well, let's get on the couch, and she just thought he was, rude, lecherous, and so forth. Um, and and it wasn't until later they met again, and it happens that her brother was a medical student at Boston University, so he got to know his brother. her brother, and they began to see each other quite often. And he says a platonic relationship. And many times they would go and travel a little bit while he was having trouble, because he was having, as I say, issues regarding marriage issues. And he was sleeping around a little bit, because um, he for some, like he began, like he was very uh, shy in that at the beginning, but then he started becoming sort of, flirting, and that went to groping, and to actually outright trying to seduce other women. And um, and I guess he says that, about 10% of the ones that he did or tried, he had sex with them. So this didn't obviously go well with Gertrude, his wife, because she was aware of this, and there was talk about it as well. And but yeah, and then every time he would go to New York, he would see Janet. And as I said, Janet was this is Janet Jepson at the time. She was a psychologist, and they got along very, very well. They really, really enjoyed each other's company. She was a bit of a health freak, eating well, and Asimov just would sort of eat anything and everything. And during the 60s, he started putting on weight, and this sort of, it did, was on his mind, because he talked about this in his diary, which then became into the autobiography. Um, and and in 1968, his parents had already, sold the candy store, and previously, and they'd sold the candy store, and they bought a few other houses, and they were living off sort of the rental from this. And but after, there's a good little anecdote. I'm not sure if I mentioned it, where his father, because he was working, the candy shop was open something like from 6 a.m. to 1 a.m. or something like that every day. And he worked there all the time, with a little nap in the afternoon. And so when he quit doing that, his father got a job in a mailroom of some company, and he says, "Oh, it's only part time," and the part time was 40 hours a week. So he considered that part time compared to what he was doing. But in 1968, they moved to Florida, and Asimov saw them off, but knowing that he would not be visiting them there. And then in what was it, in 1969, sort of things came to a head. And Robin, was his daughter, was just, middle teenage years. Gertrude, the mother, took her to England for a holiday. And obviously, Isaac, wouldn't go because of his anxiety of flying, especially, but his anxiety about travel. He would later, we'll find, visit England, though, but by boat. But he stayed home, and he was finishing up a book on humor. And he was getting, he was working away at it. And then um, his brother called, brother Stanley called, to say that their father had died. So that really, really shook him to the core. And that's where he began to really rely again a lot on Gertrude. Not Gertrude, sorry, Janet, as friendship. Robin and Gertrude were off in England. He did not tell them about this until they came back. He went to the funeral. The funeral was in New York. His body was brought up, and his mother came back and lived in a sort of a home nearby, his brother Stanley, so he could keep an eye on her. But she missed him terribly. Um, And yeah, and there was a time while Gertrude and Robin were in England, and he didn't hear anything back, and he was frantic, thinking that something had happened to her. And there's an interesting story, and I can't remember if it's during the '60s or a bit later, but I think it was during the '60s. Robin sort of started writing a little bit, and he encouraged her. And apparently it was quite good, but she didn't want to become a writer. And sort of the reason why, when he asked, was because she says that you'll be like a writer would be like you, um, and live in a room and type all day basically and not live life. Um, and the other thing was that she asked him a question at some point, to say, would you prefer, like, if you had a choice, writing or having me or children? And he hesitated for a slight second, which she noticed. And he says, well, no, it would be, the choice would be for her, to have her. But she noticed that, and mentioned it, that he did hesitate for a second. So writing to him was paramount, was number one. Um, so, but then things really, really came to a head in 1970 after they were back. There'd been talk about divorce for many years now. But in February in 1970, he was on the Dick Cavett show. It was a talk show in the U.S., and lots of writers, actors, and actresses were on there. I never tracked down. He didn't say in the autobiography what actress it was, but there was a beautiful actress apparently on there, and he made some sexual innuendos and jokes. She wasn't offended because she was. There was a situation where she was talking about her mother, but he didn't realize that, and she says, "Well, her mother's even more uh, gorgeous than she is." She just took it in her stride, apparently. But he all of a sudden went, "Oh shit," Gertrude's going to see this. So he went and told her, and that was sort of the last straw, basically. And at the same time, when it aired, Robin was watching it at a friend's place and was extremely embarrassed about it. So they just sort of separated in a sense, but living in the same house still for months, and they didn't even talk to each other. He just stayed in his attic office and wrote, and he was still working on the humor anthology, humor book, and and then in July he packed up and moved back to London to a hotel that was not too far from where Janet Jepson lived. And that was in July, and it was just short of a month of Gertrude and Isaac's 28th anniversary. And he started proceedings for divorce, but he had to. It took a long time, and we'll get into that. But there was, and he relied heavily on uh, on Janet, during that time, and eventually would move in with her. But it took about a year or more for the divorce to go through, and there was a lot of turmoil regarding that. So, anyway, and actually, yeah, in 1969, he'd hit, or around that time, he hit 100 books that he had published. A good chunk of them were done in the '60s, and to celebrate it, he published Opus 100, which is they list all the books on the back, but it's sort of his favorite parts from little bits and pieces of each book, plus occasional autobiographical or background information regarding those books in here. And yeah, so it's, he was doing extremely well. So he was making, by that was in the mid 60s, as I say, over 100,000 a year. By 1970 or so, he was making $250,000 a year, I believe, because it was reported in a newspaper regarding his divorce, or maybe a couple years later, when the divorce actually finally came through. So he was doing extremely, extremely well as a writer, but he was working like 10 hours or more a day writing, and with very, very little fiction mixed up. And because he would say yes to anything, that almost anything that came his way. And then he would even, they wanted to see sometimes bits and pieces or chapters of a book, or sections, but he would just go and write the whole thing at times on spec. And he came up with ideas, and he just pursued them, and that's how he worked. He hated working with outlines or anything, and that's like for fiction especially. But for nonfiction, he just, like I say, he cannibalized and cobbled together other pieces for books, but also started new things, writing histories, history of science, history, everything, annotated editions, all sorts of stuff that he started getting into. Anyway, we'll end it there. That's just over 20 minutes. And I do apologize that it's a bit late. I'm gonna start reading now. I'm late. About a day late reading. I'm gonna start reading the third book. What's it called there? Yeah, To Preserve, iRobot to Preserve, by Mickey Zucker Reichart. The third and last, thankfully, of the iRobot trilogy. Take care, BookTube. See you next time.